We'll pick up with, okay. So you're with Clinton, you're telling Clinton about Dick Neustadt's work on swine flu.
And when I was done with my monologue telling the president his business, he said, you know what, Paul, I was reading it last night, and you know what? I believe him. He had actually somehow discovered this book on what was really about presidential decision-making, and he'd made his own connection to how to discount scientific advice when you're making presidential decisions. Thought it was, it was typical of a Bill Clinton that I knew, but he was also a really great, accomplished politician. He invited me into the Roosevelt Room when he and Hillary Clinton were about to launch their health care proposal. It was 1,354 pages long by the time they got the whole thing assembled. And I was still enough of a policy wonk that I'd read the whole thing. So they invited me into the Roosevelt Room just before the launch to get my opinion about it. I forgot who else was there. The then chairman of DuPont. His name was Ed. I've forgotten his last name. Was there, and there were just a handful of people, though. Hillary came in first and sat down next to me on the side of the table across from the Roosevelt on the horse. And I said to her, how are you? And she said, no, I'm okay, Paul. She said, this is really hard because I'm trying to work on these important policy issues, and the media wants to write stuff about my hair and my clothes, and it's really awful to have to deal with all of that. And I must tell you, I really sympathize with that because I've always thought she was a serious public policy person, and it was awful that she had to put up with all that stuff, like it was overwhelming, the policy work she was doing. But then Clinton came rushing in, and I don't know, he may have had a couple of other people with him. He sat across the table and basically said, well, what do you think? And I said, I've been sitting up there in Pittsburgh watching this whole thing unfold, and I got to tell you, I think this whole thing is a disaster because the longer you've worked at this with Ira Magaziner, the more you've sucked yourself into an impossible morass, assigning more and more responsibility to the departments and the agencies of government, which I think is exactly the wrong thing to do. And as an illustration of that, you've created a new responsibility for the Secretary of HHS to decide personally, obviously that person won't do this, but for the department to decide how many residencies should be allocated to each university in the country for each specialty, as though you somehow had the magic formula to figure that out. It's just crazy. This is never going to succeed. And, I was unsparing. I said, I think they would tell you today. That's what I said. No different in tone and no different in, feeling this is really a shame because the country was ready for fundamental reform of what we do in health and medical care, which I believe then we needed to do and believe now we needed to do. But, we left, and they were gracious. They didn't say, we hope you'll never come again or anything like that. And so this is a day when the Business Roundtable was having a meeting in Washington. So I went back over to the Parker Hyatt Hotel on 23rd and M in Washington, went downstairs to the big ballroom, and it was a night when the president was coming to talk to the Business Roundtable group. So I had a seat in the front row. A president comes in with his entourage. He gets up on the little riser, and he makes remarks to the group. And I don't know what it was. Someone else, I guess the head of the Business Roundtable, was after the president spoke going to make remarks to the whole group, and President Clinton stayed for that. He came over and stood by me. They were all standing. He comes over and stands by me, and he says out of the side of his mouth, I really appreciate your coming in and talking to me because I always know you'll tell me the truth. You know, he's a politician to the end. He may have hated what I said to him, but, you know, he just sidled up to me and gave me that little aside. And, you know, and I have to tell you, I wanted to think it was genuine, and I think maybe it was genuine, kind of a footnote on my engagement with President Clinton. On the 19th of January, this is 2000, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in the office of the Speaker of the House on Capitol Hill. The Secretary comes in and says, the President wants to speak to you. And I said, you mean the President-elect? And she said, no, President Clinton wants to speak to you. So I said, okay. So this on the day before President Bush takes office. So I went to the phone and President Clinton said, I just wanted you to know I'm really so happy that you're going to come back to the government. You know, it was something he didn't need to do. You know, it was something I really appreciated that he would do. Kind of was a nice entry point back into government to have the departing president call and say he was glad I was coming back to government. You know, so that's the Clinton that I know. You know, I would say his greatest achievement in domestic policy while he was there was the welfare reform that he caused to happen. You know, it was based in the knowledge that those of us at the MDRC, I don't know if you know about MDRC, helped to create this knowledge base, and that Pat Moynihan was the conduit to help make it happen in the Congress. You know, so that I have really good recollection of what Clinton did in that aspect of domestic policy. And then Ron Suskind has written maybe somewhat famously about my engagement with President Bush 43, which I think certainly didn't turn out well. But I also have to say I have no regrets about giving it a shot. I still have a passion about what our country should aspire to be, and in my own way I'm still working on it.
How did you try to engage President George W. Bush?
You know, I was encouraged at the outset by Andy Card in setting up the once-a-week meetings to talk to the president about whatever you want to. You know, so I had a lot on my mind, and so I took Andy at his word. The president really wants to hear from you about whatever you want to talk to him about. You know, so there were a lot of things that I wanted to talk to him about, and you know, it wasn't spontaneous gushing. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I could say to the president about what I thought were important policy issues where I thought I brought the authority of knowledge. You know, I had caused myself to become a pretty fair expert about global climate change because it was obviously an important issue for our society. In the job that I had as CEO of Alcoa, it was a really critical question for Alcoa because we were a huge consumer of electrical energy. We were a huge byproduct producer of so-called greenhouse gas emissions. You know, I'd gotten involved in these issues a long time before. In fact, I think it was about 1986 that I gave a speech in Atlanta and opined that we should levy a 50 cent per gallon tax on gasoline because I thought it was the right thing to do from an energy point of view and also from an environmental point of view. You know, so I wasn't just a casual observer. I think I really knew what I was talking about. And, you know, I wasn't signed on then or now to interventions that would destroy our economy, but I was signed on to the idea that one of the things the federal government needed to be doing was substantially deepening our our scientific knowledge and understanding of what was happening to our biosphere, because I thought, as I said in things that I wrote, that if we get this wrong, and it's true that we're destroying our biosphere, we're not going to get another chance. And the evidence was clear enough then and now that whether you like the connection or not, the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere was continuing at an exponential rate. That was not in scientific dispute. I thought we needed to understand, if we continue at this rate, what are we going to do to ourselves? And so I said all this to the president. I'd written things. Actually, I made a mistake in my first cabinet meeting of handing out what I'd written to all the cabinet members. and I tell you why I did it. It was innocent enough, probably stupid actually, that I believe that people who were in the president's cabinet ought to have knowledge about things that were not in their direct line of sight or responsibility, because I believe well-informed citizens ought to know something about everything that's important to the future of our society. And that was not well received, I must say. But anyway, I talked to the president about global climate change. I talked to him about what I thought was a defect in his idea about elementary and secondary education. And again, it was not a casual observation. I've been involved both at a policy-making level, and at the local school level for 30 years in working on education, and I thought I knew as much or more than President Bush did about what the reality was of the defects in our educational process for elementary and secondary kids. So I talked to him about it, I think to no good purpose. I found actually a mind that was already closed, and didn't seem to be seeking new information or new insights about almost anything that I was interested in, including the things including things I had a lot more expertise than he had, and a lot more expertise than most of the people he was taking advice from. Issues of tax policy. I knew what it was like to work inside of an enterprise that was affected by the stupidity of a 10,000-page tax code. I don't think he ever caused himself to understand any of that. He knew it was there, but I don't think he really understood the implications of it. So I had a really unsatisfying experience in trying to figure out a way to connect with President Bush, and basically pleaded with Vice President Cheney to reestablish the process that had existed with President Nixon and through the Ford administration for a Brandeis brief process, hoping that if we had a carefully structured analytic process, that the president would learn from it, would be influenced by it, and that he would necessarily take on information and insights he wasn't going to get any other way. That I couldn't convince. I obviously was not successful in convincing Vice President Cheney that was the right thing to do either. And, presidents and vice presidents, I suppose, are entitled to get whatever they wish, because at least you could argue they got elected, and if they choose to govern in a particular way, and the people end up not liking it very much, it's for the account of the people who elected them.
But Vice President Cheney had been a beneficiary of the Brandeis brief process.
I think maybe he didn't see it that way. In fact, I got to tell you, I was startled when he told me toward the end of my tenure as Secretary of the Treasury that Ronald Reagan proved that deficits didn't matter. It seemed to me one of the most absurd things I'd ever heard. And he said it to me in a way that I think Dick Cheney really believed it. And he may even believe it today, which I think is, the mark of a really uninformed person, to really believe that we can, as a society, can endlessly run deficits, and it doesn't matter. You know, but you see a continuation of this thought process in what's said in public discourse about, recently even, the president, the vice president opining that the deficit is a very small fraction of GDP, as though that were dispositive. You know, it makes me wonder whether they ever pay any attention to the accumulation of federal debt and unfunded liabilities that we, the people, now have, that have grown by trillions of dollars on their watch. It's as though they don't think that's a material fact, you know, which is, I got to tell you, stunning to me.
Your friend and ally, Alan Greenspan, has just written a book. I assume you and he worked together during the Bush administration to try to make these points.
For the 23 months I was there, we did. You know, and it's interesting, his book now validates what I told Ron Suskind as he was writing the book about my experience. You know, I was sufficiently wary of the endless surpluses that people were seeing that I believe we should put in some kind of a trigger mechanism or circuit breaker mechanism, so that if it turned out the surpluses weren't really realized, that we would not be committed forever to having reduced federal revenues. And I said to Alan, you know, this is my idea, and since I had the idea, it's your responsibility to get it done, you know, which we chuckled about. But he did try, and if you read his book, he says he did try, and I think, you know, if you look at it in an unemotional way, you could argue he did try, but he got brushed off by the members of Congress, particularly members of the Senate. And Ari Fleischer said, when he was asked about the trigger idea is dead on arrival. If it comes down here, the president will veto it. You know, so, you know, it was at that point probably I should have said, this is really a terrible mistake, because surpluses are of dubious lasting prospect. But I then did say this is the first tax cut, which actually ended up being $300 billion less than what the president has proposed, or $300 million less than what the president has proposed. But in the subsequent arguments about tax policy, I argued really strenuously that there were competing priorities that should be given a lot of weight. You know, this discussion was all unfolding after 9/11, and I was arguing we shouldn't do more tax cuts because we need the revenue to deal with certain things that are certain to be needed to be dealt with, including Social Security liabilities and Medicare liabilities, and uncertainties related to the prospect of another 9/11, and at that point the prospect of actually invading Iraq. You know, so I believe there were 4 good reasons, and adding to that, you know, the need for fundamental tax reform that was going to cost some money to make the medicine go down, if you will. Those were not winning arguments, and I made them over and over again. It was in response to that Cheney told me deficits didn't matter. Reagan proved that deficits didn't matter. Yes. It was wrong-headed then. It's wrong-headed now. It's always going to be wrong-headed.
You were in government for 3 of the most traumatic moments in our history: Kennedy's assassination, Richard Nixon's resignation, and of course 9/11. Where were you the day that Kennedy was assassinated? Do you remember?
I do. You know, not only do I remember where I was, but I remember how I learned that he had been shot. You know, it was a November day, and it was It was one of those bleak, overcast, kind of not quite misty, not quite raining days in Washington. And I'd gone for a sandwich to the FDIC building across from the VA headquarters, which is still in the same place in Washington, and then taking a walk around Lafayette Park, and came back into the building and walked up the stairs to my office. And it was in a kind of a bullpen environment, and the guy who was my boss came in, it must have been a little after 1 o'clock, and said, "The president's been shot." You know, and it was just unbelievable. That the president could be shot, and then to learn that he was in fact dead, and then to walk out on the streets again and have this eerie sense that no one was on the streets. You know, people were paralyzed looking at their televisions to see this whole thing unfold, and then to go home and spend the next several days in front of the television, you know, seeing the Jack Ruby events and the looking for Oswald and all of that. Those are really still unforgettable moments. And you know, for my wife and I, they were the days of still sitting in front of a black and white television. So, you know, it's those images that I still remember. It was not in living color. It was all in black and white, which had its own starkness about it. You know, and for me, the John picture is there, and it's not because of something I saw in the newspaper. It's seeing it on live television. You know, in effect, being a witness to all of that.
Where he salutes his father's casket.
Yeah. The Nixon resignation time was really something. I had gone down to Bethany Beach, which is a place that my wife and I started going to even before we could afford to stay overnight with our 4 children. But in 1974, we'd rented a place for a month, and I was only able to be there for short periods of time. But I was there for a couple of days before the resignation, and you know, I was constantly on the telephone because you couldn't get away from things that were going on. But after the resignation speech, I got in the car and drove back to Washington. It was a night when it was pouring down rain. We had moved into a new house, and the contractor had done a bad job, and so the window wells captured these avalanches of water that were coming from the gutters. And when I got home, this must have been 1 o'clock in the morning, I had 3 feet of water in my basement and a need to go back down to the White House by 6 o'clock in the morning. You know, so I was really torn by, you know, I got this personal disaster and I've got this professional disaster. But, you know, it was clear he wasn't going to make it, that he was going to, if he didn't get thrown out, he was going to have to resign. So it was not a surprise. But I was so invested in all of this, and I was so much a part of the administration by that point that, you know, I was included in everything. And so I was in the East Room for the Nixon farewell speech, and I was over by the south windows, I guess, if you know that East Room well, kind of behind where John Whitaker sat in the front row and cried like a baby. You know, it was really unbelievably emotional to be there as Nixon spoke and remembered Teddy Roosevelt and It talked with the girls and Pat Nixon standing behind him. That was really a heavy emotional moment. But you know, for me, it's a companion moment then to one that happened just a couple of hours later, sitting in that same room with the chairs rearranged a little bit to hear President Ford give his first speech as president, and to feel the sense of positive that we're going forward, and this really good guy is going to be the president. You know, and to see those things personally in the same room on the same day was really quite an emotion-charged thing. And then, you know, to hit the ground running, because the presidency doesn't ever stop, and so President Ford's got this avalanche of stuff coming at him, and he needs to be briefed, and he needs to be informed. And so you get too much time to linger about the remnants of the Nixon administration, because government and life goes on. You know, the activities in Vietnam don't stop because we have this change in presidencies. You're right, those are really emotional moments.
Where were you on September 11th?
You know, I had, when I was Secretary of the Treasury, I spent a lot of time out of the country, which I did when I was the CEO of Alcoa, because Alcoa was of the world, if you will. We had operations in 43 countries. And so I was not a casual, occasional visitor to other places around the world. I spent an enormous amount of time around the world. And an important part of the work that I saw for a Secretary of Treasury was to be knowledgeable about other places around the world. And so in the days leading to 9/11, I was in China, and actually on 9/10, 9/11, ended up at like 7:30 or 7:45 at night in Tokyo, on my way from China into Japan to spend a few days in Japan. And I was in the Imperial Hotel, which is one of my favorite hotels in Tokyo, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and built in the late 20s. And Tim Adams, my chief of staff, came and knocked on my door at it must have been 10 minutes till 9. We were upside down 12 hours from the U.S. to say there's just been a plane crash at the World Trade Center. And then to begin quickly getting a real-time television feed, and to actually see in real time almost the second plane hit the second tower, and then to start thinking about we're part of this, we've got to do something about this, and to quickly start arranging transportation back to the United States, which we did the next afternoon at 1 o'clock Tokyo time. They scrambled a plane from Okinawa for me, and we flew back to Washington, refueled over Alaska, and arrived back at Andrews Air Force Base something around 6 o'clock at night Eastern time on Wednesday, because the world was stunned, and the markets were closed, and President Bush was ordering people, we got to restart the markets tomorrow, and my people were saying, we're going to have a disaster if we insist. And so I called Andy Card and said, we can't do this. We have to do it in a way that we can be sure that when we announce we're going to restart the markets, we can actually do it. And right now, the communications equipment that provides the support for the New York Stock Exchanges got 30 feet of water in the basement. We need to figure out how to deal with that.
Wow. I have a few Nixon housekeeping questions, if you don't mind continuing. Just a few. I want to ask you about The Nixon administration took a good hard look at health care, and you were at the center of that discussion. How close did we come to having a national health insurance program?
You know, I think we came really very close to having an integrated, carefully constructed federal policy about health and medical care. I think it's Valentine's Day. I forget whether it was 1971 or 1972. President Nixon sent to the Congress a message devoted only to health and medical care, and it represented an integrated view of what we, the people of the United States, should be doing about health and medical care, from research to environmental considerations. You know, thinking back on it, the president was really inquisitive about health and medical care, and he directed us to look at the aspects of health and medical care in a really full way. And it's all reflected in that health policy document from the early 1970s, where we were proposing the family health insurance plan. That's kind of a companion to the cash family assistance plan. You know, there were big disputes in those days about how individuals and families would respond to different levels of so-called co-insurance and deductibles. And that whole debate led to the federal funding of the RAND work on health insurance, which are still famous. You know, they are the landmark study of behavioral responses related to health and medical care, co-insurance deductibles, so that we could understand, I think for all time, what effect co-insurance deductibles would have on people's choices for preventive examinations and consumption of medications and all that kind of thing. You know, in a way, it established the intellectual framework for everything that has gone on since then, including the Clinton proposals, the old Clinton proposals, the new Clinton proposals are all progeny of the Nixon framing of the health and medical care issues, I think. You know, there's a lot of room for scholars to investigate and understand. And in a way, I think the Nixon work in health that we all did in health and medical care was a framing point that changed what had gone before in terms of thinking about healthcare policy in the United States.
And why wasn't the administration able to achieve a little more in healthcare at the time?
Well, I think we did achieve some things. You know, we wrote, some of us wrote the first drafts of the Health Maintenance Organization legislation. You know, in a way, I'm fond of saying, you know, we did a whole lot of things that were well intended. They didn't all turn out well. You know, I think so-called regional medical programs were a good idea, but they had their own downsides. The Partnership for Health ideas, in some ways, were a good idea, but they had their own perverse downsides. But they all, I think, you know, we learned some things. I hope we don't have to relearn some of those things that we
So you've changed your mind on HMOs?
I think there's a utility to HMOs. But I tell you what I think now, and it's something I'm spending a lot of time working on. I think if we're ever going to achieve what's possible in the health and medical care in the United States, there's some fundamental things that we need to do that need to be done at the federal level. It can only actually be done at the federal level. For example, the reimbursement system that has been created is a travesty, a cynical travesty. So that if you go look now at the difference between what institutions bill, insurance companies and Medicare, and what they actually receive from those agencies and from private insurance companies in reimbursements, unless you know something about this, you'd probably be surprised to know that the difference between the billed amounts and the reimbursement amounts is the difference between 100% and 31%. For community hospitals, it's only about 26% for academic medical centers. So we've got this cynical business of you get billed for these huge amounts and everyone knows you don't really get reimbursed for that. It's all a very bad, cynical joke, I think. But, it's only indicative of the mess that we've got that in some ways is fostered by the federal government. There's no transparency in health and medical care about things gone wrong. Occasionally, the society gets a glimpse of things gone wrong. And individuals get a glimpse on a fairly regular basis, but they don't put their knowledge together. So, for example, something like 1 in 14 people who go into an acute care facility in this country get an infection that they didn't bring with them. It's unbelievable. It costs an enormous amount of money. It contributes to a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering. Now, why is it that we don't see that on a national basis? Because if institutions make all of that publicly clear, they'll get sued by the lawyers until they have nothing left, okay? So we have an absolute lid on transparency, which is crazy because I think if you go around and you become knowledgeable about health medical care providers, I defy you to find someone that you would say is a deliberate malefactor, that deliberately hurts people. No one deliberately gives someone else an infection, but they do it. All right, so on the one hand you have the reality, and on the other hand you have the fact that these are not deliberate. And so if we could get people to report everything gone wrong, including hospital-acquired infections, we would have a transparency that we don't have now. To me it's obvious we need to abandon or kill the medical malpractice idea and basically say, in exchange for transparent reporting, we, the society, through the progressive tax system, will pay people who have an economic consequence of something gone wrong in medical treatment. We will compensate you for the economic loss, and out of that we will gain enough information so that we've substantially and continuously reduced the number of things gone wrong.
We have to have a progressive tax system, though, for that.
Well, it's another subject that we can talk about, but it's an example of a thing that we can only do at the federal level. You can't do this on a community-by-community basis because it won't work.
It goes back to your story about syringes.
Exactly. It's exactly the same kind of thing.
Let me ask you, because I don't want to take more of your time, you've been very kind. One of the things you have had to think about as a student of government is what to do with the baby boomers, and it's something that you focused on when you were Treasury Secretary. You were in government when Social Security was indexed, which some of...
It was maybe Nixon's worst policy mistake.
How did that happen?
I don't think he... I think this was a purely political decision. You know, it was before we got the Brandeis brief process really installed. This is something he did really early in his administration. I know where he got this idea, but somebody convinced him that it was innocent enough for him to align himself with the principle that people should have cost of living index for Social Security benefits. It was a terrible, terrible idea. You know, the Congress jumped on it, and Wilbur Mills saw himself as a presidential candidate in 1972, and he helped to get it through the Congress. It was a terrible idea then, it's a terrible idea now, and we'll forever pay for the consequences of that really bad policy decision. But again, I would say, for me, the reference point is Nixon didn't have the advantage of a careful analysis process when he decided to do this early in his administration. It was crazy.
What role did John Ehrlichman play in creating a Brandeis process on the domestic
I think.
side?
You know, I think many people who are old enough to have seen the Watergate hearings have this image of John Ehrlichman, the snarling, insolent person who was a high-level advisor to Nixon. Yeah, and I have to admit, if that's what you saw of John Ehrlichman, it was not too hard to form that opinion. On the other hand, if you worked with John Ehrlichman, as I did, you know, I knew a completely different person. I was startled by how John presented himself at the Watergate hearings, because the Ehrlichman that I knew was really in it for helping the president do good and right things. You know, and ideologically, I saw he and Pat Moynihan as really close cousins. You know, so, you know, I saw Ehrlichman as a good guy. It turned out his public persona on television was not that good guy that I knew.
Well, which was the reality? Or again, did he have several people?
I don't know. Maybe he was several different people. You know, he came to see me. It was interesting. After he left the government, but when I was still there, this must have been in 1976, he really got interested in Indian affairs, and he came to lobby me about something about Indian affairs in 1976. You know, and he was going through a really tough time, I think. He and his wife got divorced, and he was kind of trying to find his footing in those days, I think. The last time I saw him was at Hofstra University when there was a conference sponsored by the university to talk about the Nixon presidency. And it was not too long before he died.
From your vantage point, what role did Haldeman play in creating the Brandeis memo system?
I think he was the enforcer. You know, I think he saw his role as to make sure the president got what he needed. Unfortunately, he was also an enforcer in some other ways, I think, not quite so positive. You know, and I never saw the ugly side of Nixon personally, but there was a time when we got an order. When I say we, I mean we, the associate directors of OMB, got an order that we were to cut off all funding to university, all research funding to universities where there were campus protests against the Vietnamese War. You know, so, and particularly those terrible people at MIT, I know they're listed, you know, don't let those people have any more federal money. And I think that came from Haldeman's office. And it was probably a reflection of what Nixon said. So the three associate directors, myself, I think it was myself, Bill Morrill, and Ken Dam, went to see George Shultz and said to George Shultz, if we have to do this, we resign. There's no basis in law to carry out this order. And, you know, the Congress establishes eligibility for federal grant funds, and the authorities vested in the departments and agencies that receive the funds. We have no authority here in the executive office to overrule them, and we're not going to do it. And George said, leave it with me. And, you know, the next day we were told, stand down, you don't have to do that, and you don't have to resign. So George was a really important influence. You know, and it's apparent now in retrospect and with what one sees in the Nixon tapes, he didn't get called into every event, but, you know, when he got called in, he stood up. And he prevailed.
He did that with the IRS when they won.
Exactly.
In the same way. So this must have been in the run-up to the '72 campaign. When was this?
No, I think this was in '73, and maybe in early '73, before Ehrlichman and Haldeman resigned on April the 30th.
It's early '73. So he was then Treasury Secretary.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not. But why would you go to him when you were at the OM? I'm a little.
He was still George was really smart. When he became Secretary of the Treasury, he kept his title as Assistant to the President for Economic Affairs, and he had his little cubbyhole office in the White House.
Oh.
Yeah, he was still sitting up there.
So you didn't go to Roy Ashe about this. You went to.
No, Roy was the director of OMB. We needed to talk to somebody who could have some influence.
Was he a little upset that you went to Schultz?
No. I don't think Roy ever gave it a thought.
Was Fred Malek a little upset that you did that?
If he was, I never heard it from him.
No, it's just interesting. The three assistant directors went to see Schultz. Well, you had worked for him before.
Yeah, he was our godfather or something.
Since this is an issue today and students will know about it, how well did we handle the energy crisis? No.
We haven't ever done anything. We just talked about it.
Just in your period, though. I mean, in '73, that was a challenge you faced.
Hmm. You know, we've always since the early days we've had endless conversations. In fact, you know, again, it's the prescience of President Nixon. He knew that energy and the environment were going to be generational issues before any other person, I think, in public life, and knew it in a way that had consequences. He created EPA, you know, and he knew that energy was going to be a crisis in the not-too-distant future, and formed task forces to work on these issues. You know, I think, you know, a lot of apparatus was created. The Energy Department was created, and, you know, we've talked a lot about it, but we still haven't taken major, tangible action that we need to take, for example, for doing something about nuclear power. You know, we haven't built a new plant, I think, since 1975. You know, although we've been talking about it since the first oil embargo, haven't done anything. I think that this administration has accomplished almost nothing. They've just talked about it. But they're not alone.
You're talking about the Bush administration?
Yeah. They're not alone. I mean, you know, it's been a long time since 1973, right? I mean, do Ford and Carter and 2 terms of Reagan and Bush 41 and Clinton and Bush 43.
Last question. You talked about the Family Assistance Program being one of the one of the victims, one of the
And the
lost as
casualties.
casualties
Yeah.
of Watergate. From a domestic policy standpoint, where you were, can you point to any other initiatives that went with Watergate that President Ford was not able to restart when he came into office?
Well, most people will not remember this, but President Ford had a national health insurance proposal that was the beneficiary of even more refined thinking than what we'd done in the Nixon proposal. So President Ford recommended in his 1976 budget documents that we create a mandated catastrophic health insurance program for the American people. It was, so I guess I could say it's at least 31 years ahead of its time because we still haven't done it. It still, I think, is the right thing to have done. But I think the lack of political capital in the Ford administration was an overflow consequence from Watergate and then from the Nixon pardon, so that President Ford didn't have an ability to accomplish really major things in initiating major things that came to be realized. He had serious and important ideas about energy policy as well, but we were never able to mount a real offensive.
Mr. O'Neill, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much.
You got a lot more than you asked for.
I know I did. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You'll have a lot to cut.
I'm not going to cut it. I mean, it's for scholars.